The number one thing I see overlooked and not taken into consideration, yet has a significant influence on our shoulder mobility, is our neck and our cervical spine. For whatever reason, I don't see a lot of people talk about the relationship between the neck and the shoulder. Let's break down a little bit of what we're looking at here. When we raise our arm overhead, if we were to raise one arm above our head into full shoulder flexion or overhead mobility, we would have a very slight degree of a cervical spine turn towards that side. Now, this is not something we can visually see, but it does occur primarily at these lower cervical vertebrae, which when they're in a resting position, they tend to be more forward into flexion in a healthy spine curve of the neck, and the upper cervical vertebrae tend to be more back, which allows us to get that cervical lordosis. So once I get in the upper ranges of shoulder flexion, about 120 degrees relative to the trunk or more, I need those lower cervical vertebrae to slightly rotate towards that side, which would be the left side in this example right here. If I can't do that, then my rib cage is usually going to be in this compressed, tight position, which isn't allowing for my scapula to glide on my rib cage very well for upward rotation, external rotation, and what we need for proper coupling of the mechanics between the humerus and the scapula. In my biomechanics courses, I refer to the shoulder flexion range of motion and assessment as the ultimate representation of how healthy the relationship is between the rib cage, scapula, and humerus. There's different ranges of shoulder flexion that represent different areas of compression within the rib cage. For example, if I can't get into at least 60 degrees of genuine shoulder flexion without compensation, I have compression below my scapula and tightness below my scapula. I can't even get my scapula to start to move in the first place, really. This represents my scapula needing to move away from my spine, and I need the muscles in between them to not be really tight and the rib cage to not be really restrictive and compressed too. So if I have an inability to get to 120 degrees, I have some degree of compression and tightness here. Now, as I get to the end range, what happens is my scapula is already pretty upwardly rotated. But in order for me to get higher, the scapula actually tips back on the rib cage. It moves into a posterior rotation or orientation. And this allows for me to get that last little bit of shoulder flexion. And this very slight cervical spine turn towards that side is one part of the equation that helps us get space in this upper part of the rib cage for the scapula to be able to posteriorly tip. So in summary, if I can't get my head to genuinely turn towards one side, or I have a limitation in cervical rotation, I'm also going to be limited in shoulder mobility on that side. You can test this right now. Just keep your head very still and very subtly and slowly turn your head without doing anything where your whole head's moving as one unit and your neck's moving as one unit. Just pivot from the center of your head, and once you start to hit resistance, you'll know it and you'll feel it, and that's when you need to stop. Any more than about 2 out of 10 resistance, because we can easily push through it if we just shove our neck into that direction. And then you can try the other side. You're gonna notice a difference. Now, on the side that's more limited, you will also probably be limited in your ability to move into full shoulder flexion on that side. But you need to know how to assess your genuine shoulder flexion range of motion without compensation. And this is exactly how I do that.
To set up for this, we want to be on a table or on the ground. It doesn't really matter for this test, but we want to be nice and relaxed and long through our body. So what we want to do is start with our palm facing directly up towards the ceiling and a very, very slight bend within our elbow. So now, Trevor, what I want you to do is keep your palm facing up the whole time and that slight bend in the elbow, and now go directly overhead, keeping your arm in the same plane, meaning that it's going straight back. The second he feels his elbow start to deviate out or his palms start to twist in, the test is over, and it really is the very second that that happens. The other thing that we're going to see is that there will be a desire for this person to extend their back and arch these ribs up, and that will allow them to get further back, but that's a compensation. The other thing that we'll see here is people will get stuck at a certain point in this test and they're going to want to jam through it. So they might feel some restriction, let's say right here, and then they can push through it, but they're going to use a muscular strategy in order to push through that resistance. And oftentimes that's going to be accompanied by other compensations that we touched on earlier. Just make sure that once you feel yourself really needing to force yourself through it, a little resistance is okay, but if you really feel like you have to put more than about a 4 out of 10 effort to get further back, that's an indication that this is not a range of motion you can easily access. Another thing you're going to see in this test is that as he brings that elbow back, he will start to deviate out to the side. And that's usually going to be accompanied by that elbow turning out. But we want to make sure we're staying perfectly in line. It's more challenging than a lot of people think, but this is a true reflection of how this person can achieve shoulder flexion. So if this deviates out, the test is over. If the elbow turns out, the test is over. If these ribs flare at all, the test is over.
What you want to be able to do is pair the mechanics of the cervical spine with the degree of shoulder flexion that you have, and you can start to match that up with what happens when we inhale and exhale to start to work ourselves into more space. When I inhale, I'm going to systemically be in more of an externally rotated position, which means that my rib cage is externally rotated, my shoulder is externally rotated. When I exhale, the inverse happens. My ribs move down, I'm going to be more internally rotated within my shoulder. So if you have 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, here's an exercise you can do to start to get that area to work together more effectively. Do this for about 10 to 20 reps, 2 sets of it, and then retest your ability to turn your head to that side and also move into shoulder flexion. This is the hook-lying screwdriver armbar with cervical rotation. To set up for this, we're going to be in this hook-lying A-frame position with our feet elevated on something where we can keep our whole foot flat and is about 2 to 4 inches tall. And then what we're going to do is get a light weight. It doesn't need to be heavier than about 5 to 10 pounds. That's the maximum I would go there. And we're going to use a kettlebell here because that allows us to get a nice reach with that weight, but a dumbbell would also be totally fine and appropriate. So we're just gonna be in this position and just feel our whole foot flat and drag our heels, have the intention to drag our heels towards our butt, which is gonna give us a little bit of hamstrings on both sides. But the low back needs to remain flat. Now we're just gonna get a nice subtle reach and protraction of the shoulder. We're not gonna depress our sternum as we do that. We just want to get a nice, very subtle reach. And then what we're going to do is make sure that that kettlebell or dumbbell is resting along the palm of our hand and we can keep that nice and stacked. And then we're going to initiate this by inhaling and gently, very gently turning our head to the same side and supinating the hand or turning it out, and then exhaling through our mouth fully and returning back to this pronated position and a neutral head position. Only stay within the range of motion you feel comfortable rotating your neck. Don't overdo it, because if you do, it's not going to feel great. Just work within the means of what you're capable. As you progress through this set, you can potentially start to turn your head a little bit more, but it should never be uncomfortable. It should feel nice and smooth and easy. The most common mistake here is that people, when they get that reach, are going to shrug their shoulder into their ear. So we want to avoid that. Keep the shoulder out of the ear, but still maintain that reach. The other thing is people's wrists are going to get cranked back like that. Make sure you have a nice stacked wrist with that kettlebell resting within the groove of that palm right there. My shoulder health program takes into consideration the whole body and how all these structures of the spine, the head, the shoulder blade, even the pelvis is related to shoulder health. And if you want a comprehensive approach to that, then I would recommend checking that out, and I will link it down below in the description. If you don't have 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, what you could actually do is a very light biceps curl. Yeah, I mean literally do a biceps curl, a preacher curl variation specifically. We're gonna be reaching low, usually about less than a 60-degree angle of our humerus to our trunk. And we're gonna be turning our head and sternum towards that side. Now pay attention to that. As I reach my arm out in front of me, my scapula is going to move away from my spine slightly because that requires protraction of the scapula. Now if I were to turn my sternum also towards that side as I reach my arm, that's going to have my spine turn towards that side, obviously. Now, if my spine turns towards that side, these spinous processes, these pointy things at the end of each vertebrae, are going to face the opposite side. So left trunk rotation, Spinous processes are going to be facing right, which means that this stuff in between our scapula and our spine, these tissues, can be elongated, and we can breathe into that space and decompress it. Try this with a very light weight, maybe 10, 15 pounds, 20 if you're really strong, but don't go much more than that, just to feel this out for about 3 sets of 10 breaths, and then retest those ranges of motion. This is the respiratory preacher curl. To set up for this, we need to get a bench on an inclined setting so that we are in this sort of preacher curl position passively to start. So we have a pretty straight arm here. We're gonna have a straight wrist relative to our forearm. And also what we're gonna do is get in a staggered stance. So the same arm that's curling is going to be the foot that is back. So left foot back, right foot's just about a half step in front, but most of the weight is going to be on the left heel, keeping both feet flat. So what we're gonna do now is initiate this by staying very tall within our torso, but we're going to subtly turn our sternum towards the side we're going to be pulling with. That's the left. So you want the sternum to actually face the left arm, but you don't want to lose any height in your skeleton as you do that. So that would be slouching. We don't want that. As tall as we can get, and then turn it. It doesn't have to face literally all the way over to the left, just as long as it's sort of facing more of the left side of the hemisphere of your body, you're gonna be in a good position. So in this position here, he's gonna feel maybe a very subtle stretch between his left shoulder blade and his spine, right in between there. If he does, that's good. Shouldn't be extreme, just that subtle turn of the sternum while staying tall should allow you to get that. Now what we'll do is keep our weight on our left heel, and then just inhale, curl up, keeping that straight wrist. Exhale down. Inhale through the nose up. Exhale down. Great. The most common mistake here is people create too big of a turn, either with their head or they do it so much to their torso that they end up kind of like slouching and shrugging into their head there. We don't want that to happen. Keep your shoulder out of your ear. Stay tall, get a little bit of a turn. So you are gonna have a little bit of that rib cage retraction. And if you're not feeling the stretch in between your shoulder blade and spine, again, it's super minor, maybe just 3 out of 10. Think about reaching your elbow that way, like you're protracting your shoulder, but it will still stay on the bench, and that should allow you to reach and get that turn that we're looking for there. The last thing to look out for here is arching the low back excessively. And when people start to get tired, that tends to happen. So just make sure that you're keeping your weight on your heel and a subtle tuck. Just make sure that on either of these exercises, you're not overly rotating your neck. Very subtle within a very comfortable range of motion. If you overdo it, you're gonna be making things worse. So just make sure that you're going nice and easy, just like I would recommend on any exercise that's more corrective in nature on my channel.